The Capitol Rotunda echoed with tension as Speaker Mike Johnson strode confidently toward the press podium, flanked by senior Republican leaders. Camera lights flashed as he adjusted his red tie and tapped the microphone. "Today, I am announcing a formal motion to remove Representative Jasmine Crockett from the House Judiciary Committee," Johnson declared, his voice firm and self-assured. "Her recent conduct has demonstrated a pattern of disrespect for this institution and its procedures that cannot be tolerated." The assembled reporters leaned forward, sensing a major political showdown brewing. Johnson's face reflected absolute certainty as he continued, "The integrity of our committees depends on members who respect the process. Representative Crockett has repeatedly crossed the line, and accountability is necessary." What Johnson didn't notice was Representative Crockett quietly entering from the side, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. As reporters began shouting questions, she calmly approached a second microphone. "Mr. Speaker," she said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "before you continue this charade, you should know that I've just filed a formal censure motion against you, with evidence of your direct violation of House ethics rules." Johnson's expression froze. The confidence drained from his face as Crockett held up a document bearing the official House seal. "The vote is scheduled for tomorrow morning," she added calmly. "I suggest you prepare your defense." Before diving into this explosive political showdown that has Washington buzzing, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss our latest political confrontations and power plays that the mainstream media won't show you in full. Jasmine Crockett and Mike Johnson represented opposite ends of America's political spectrum, their collision course set by fundamentally different visions of governance and power. At 42, Crockett had built her reputation first as a civil rights attorney in Texas before winning election to Congress in 2022. The former state representative had quickly distinguished herself as a fearless questioner in committee hearings, her legal background evident in her methodical cross-examinations of witnesses. With a talent for breaking down complex legal concepts into accessible language, she had become a rising star among progressives and a frequent target for conservatives. Colleagues described Crockett as meticulous in her preparation and strategic in her approach to political battles. "She doesn't throw punches randomly," one Democratic representative noted privately. "When Jasmine moves against you, she's already mapped out 3 steps ahead." Mike Johnson, 52, had risen to the speakership through careful positioning and relationship building within Republican circles. The Louisiana representative had emerged as a compromise candidate following the chaotic removal of Kevin McCarthy, presenting himself as a steady hand who could unite the fractured Republican conference. As Speaker, Johnson had developed a management style that relied heavily on procedural power and party discipline. When faced with opposition, his instinct was to leverage the considerable institutional authority of his office rather than engage in direct debate. "Mike believes in hierarchical order," a longtime colleague observed. "He expects respect for the office and the institution, which in his mind means respect for his authority." The tension between Johnson and Crockett had been building for months. During heated Judiciary Committee hearings on voting rights, Crockett had repeatedly challenged Johnson's allies with precise legal questions they struggled to answer. Her effectiveness had not gone unnoticed by Republican leadership, who viewed her as an emerging threat to their messaging on key issues. The immediate conflict had ignited 3 days earlier, when Crockett had used her questioning time to press a controversial judicial nominee about his past statements on civil rights. When the committee chair attempted to cut her off, citing time limitations, Crockett had continued her line of questioning, arguing that male colleagues had been granted similar leeway. Johnson had seized on this procedural dispute as grounds to launch a removal action, a rarely used and extreme measure that would strip Crockett of her committee assignment. Behind closed doors, Johnson told allies this would send a message about respecting institutional order. Publicly, he framed it as a necessary step to maintain committee decorum. What Johnson couldn't have known was that Crockett had been quietly building a case against him for weeks. Working with House ethics specialists, she had documented instances where Johnson had directed committee chairs to selectively enforce rules against Democratic members while allowing similar or more egregious behavior from Republicans. More damaging, she had obtained internal communications showing Johnson had personally intervened in committee proceedings in ways that violated House rules regarding separation of powers between leadership and committees. These included text messages directing specific lines of questioning and instructing chairs when to cut off Democratic members. The stakes couldn't have been higher for either politician. For Johnson, removing Crockett would demonstrate his authority and potentially sideline a formidable opponent. For Crockett, this represented both an existential threat to her legislative effectiveness and an opportunity to expose what she saw as systematic abuse of power. As news of Johnson's removal attempt and Crockett's surprise censure motion spread through Washington, both sides recognized this confrontation would define political narratives for months to come. Committee assignments and censure motions might seem like inside baseball to average Americans, but in the power corridors of the Capitol, they represented the highest form of political warfare. The next 24 hours would determine not just the fate of these two political careers, but potentially the balance of power in a closely divided House where every committee seat and leadership position could tip crucial votes and investigations. Johnson's press conference collapsed into chaos after Crockett's unexpected appearance. As reporters shouted questions about the censure motion, Johnson's staff hastily ushered him away from the podium, citing a previously scheduled meeting, a transparent excuse that only heightened media interest. Within minutes, Johnson had convened an emergency meeting with his leadership team in the Speaker's office. The ornate room, typically a setting for carefully choreographed political victories, now hosted a crisis session. "How did she blindside us with a censure motion?" Johnson demanded, pacing behind his desk. "And what evidence is she claiming to have?" His chief of staff looked uncomfortable. "We're still gathering information, Mr. Speaker, but preliminary reports suggest she's focusing on your communications with committee chairs. Those are normal leadership functions," Johnson insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "There may be some text messages that could be interpreted as procedural interference," his deputy admitted reluctantly. Meanwhile, Crockett was conducting her own press briefing in a smaller room down the hall, methodically laying out the grounds for her censure motion. "The Speaker's removal action against me is not just politically motivated retaliation," she explained, her tone measured and legal. "It's part of a pattern of procedural abuse that undermines the basic functioning of this institution." She displayed a chart showing statistical analysis of interrupted speaking time in the Judiciary Committee, broken down by party and gender. The data revealed a stark pattern. Democratic women were interrupted at 3 times the rate of Republican men, with the disparity increasing after Johnson became Speaker. "But the censure motion goes beyond these troubling patterns," Crockett continued. "I have documented evidence of direct interference by the Speaker in committee proceedings in violation of House Rule 11 and precedents dating back to 1910. She held up a sealed folder. "This includes text messages where the Speaker explicitly directed when to cut off questioning of specific members, a clear violation of the independence of committees that has been foundational to House operations for over a century." The press corps was electrified. Procedural violations rarely generated headlines, but the personal drama between Johnson and Crockett had transformed arcane House rules into compelling political theater. Back in Johnson's office, the strategy session had grown increasingly tense as more details emerged about Crockett's evidence. "She can't possibly have those texts," a senior advisor insisted. "Someone leaked them," Johnson replied, his face tight with anger. "Find out who, immediately." His political director shifted uncomfortably. "Mr. Speaker, there's another problem. 5 moderate Republicans from swing districts are signaling they may support the censure motion or at least abstain." Johnson slammed his hand on the desk. "That's unacceptable. Remind them who controls committee assignments and campaign funds." "With respect, sir, that approach might backfire given the nature of the censure charges," his chief of staff cautioned. As the afternoon progressed, the confrontation escalated beyond the principles to engulf the entire House. Party whips on both sides were frantically counting votes, while constitutional scholars were being booked on cable news to explain the rarely used procedures at play. Crockett, meanwhile, was methodically building public support with a series of strategic media appearances. Rather than leaning on fiery rhetoric, she presented herself as a reluctant institutional defender. "This isn't personal," she told a prominent political podcast. "The Speaker is entitled to his policy views. What he's not entitled to do is selectively enforce rules based on party or gender, or to direct committee chairs to violate the independence of their committees." This framing was particularly effective because it appealed to institutional traditionalists in both parties. By early evening, 3 former House parliamentarians had issued a joint statement expressing serious concern about the procedural issues raised by Representative Crockett. Johnson's team attempted to regain control of the narrative with a hastily arranged interview on a friendly network, but the speaker appeared defensive and underprepared when pressed on specific rule violations. These are normal communications between leadership and chairs, he insisted, though his usual confidence was noticeably absent. Including texts directing when to cut off specific members' questioning? The interviewer pressed. I don't recall the specific messages you're referencing, Johnson replied, a response that would be replayed endlessly in news cycles. As night fell, the political dynamics shifted dramatically when the influential House Freedom Caucus announced they would meet to discuss the situation. Though nominally aligned with Johnson, the conservative bloc had grown frustrated with what they viewed as his accommodations to moderates. Several members saw this as an opportunity to extract concessions in exchange for their support. The speaker needs every vote tomorrow, one Freedom Caucus member told reporters cryptically. This might be a good time to revisit some of our policy priorities. By midnight, what had begun as Johnson's attempt to discipline a junior member had transformed into a multi-dimensional political crisis that threatened his leadership position. The vote count for the competing motions remained fluid, with both sides claiming narrow advantages. Crockett, who had anticipated being on the defensive against a removal attempt, instead found herself leading what had evolved into a referendum on Johnson's leadership style. The dynamic captured a fundamental truth of Washington power politics. Procedural fights that seemed obscure to outsiders could rapidly escalate into existential battles with far-reaching consequences. As members retired for the night, the Capitol hummed with late meetings and negotiations. The morning vote loomed as a critical inflection point not just for Johnson and Crockett, but potentially for the balance of power in a closely divided Congress, where every leadership position and committee seat carried outsized importance. The House chamber filled unusually early the next morning. By 8:30 a.m., most seats were occupied, most rarity for a body where members typically filtered in gradually throughout the day. The galleries were packed with staffers, journalists, and visitors sensing historic drama. Johnson entered from the speaker's office, flanked by his leadership team. Their faces reflected a night of minimal sleep and maximum stress. Crockett arrived shortly after, accompanied by 2 senior Democratic women known for their procedural expertise. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with Johnson's visible tension. At precisely 9:00 a.m., the House was called to order. Following routine opening business, the clerk announced, "Pursuant to House Resolution 423, the House will now consider the privilege motion regarding Representative Crockett's committee assignment." Johnson rose to speak, his prepared remarks carefully crafted to focus on institutional respect rather than partisan advantage. "This motion is not about policy disagreements," he began, his voice steadier than the previous day. "It addresses repeated violations of committee decorum that undermine our ability to conduct the people's business." He outlined several instances where Crockett had continued questioning after time expired or challenged the chair's rulings. Though technically accurate, the example seemed remarkably minor for such a dramatic response as committee removal. "Our committees function through mutual respect for procedures," Johnson concluded. "When members deliberately disregard these procedures, appropriate consequences are necessary." Democratic leaders immediately rose to Crockett's defense, characterizing Johnson's action as unprecedented overreach and transparent retaliation against an effective questioner. But the most devastating response came from Crockett herself. When recognized to speak, she approached the matter not with righteous indignation but with methodical precision that reflected her legal background. "Mr. Speaker," she began, "before addressing the removal motion, I believe members should have full context about selective enforcement of the very rules being discussed." He directed attention to display screens where a statistical analysis appeared showing speaking time and interruptions across committees, broken down by party and demographics. These patterns reveal that women of color experience interruptions at nearly 4 times the rate of other members when asking similarly structured questions, Crockett noted, letting the data speak for itself without inflammatory characterization. She then pivoted to the core of her defense. While claiming to protect procedural integrity, The Speaker has repeatedly undermined it through direct interference in committee operations. At this point, Crockett introduced her most damaging evidence, text messages displayed on the chamber screens showing Johnson instructing committee chairs on when to recognize specific members and when to cut off questioning. One particularly damaging exchange showed Johnson texting a committee chair, "Don't let Crockett go more than 3 mins on the voting rights witness. Cut her off even if others went longer." The chamber erupted in murmurs as members absorbed the implications. These messages directly contradicted Johnson's claim of simply enforcing existing rules and revealed targeted actions against Crockett specifically. House rules have established committee independence for over a century, precisely to prevent leadership from controlling questioning in this manner, Crockett explained, now transitioning from defense to offense. She introduced her countermotion, a rare censure resolution against the Speaker himself for abuse of power and undermining fundamental House procedures. The debate that followed revealed shifting dynamics as members processed the evidence. Several moderate Republicans, initially inclined to support Johnson, now expressed concerns about the text messages. 2 explicitly stated they could not vote for the removal motion given the evidence of targeted enforcement. Most damaging for Johnson, the Freedom Caucus, whose support he needed, announced they would condition their votes on leadership concessions unrelated to Crockett. This naked political opportunism undermined Johnson's attempt to frame the issue around institutional respect. As the morning progressed, Johnson's team frantically worked the floor, offering committee assignments, campaign support, and policy concessions to wavering members. But the momentum had clearly shifted away from them. The defining moment came when a respected Republican committee chair rose to speak. Though careful not to directly criticize the Speaker, she noted that committee independence has been a cornerstone of House operations since the reforms of 1910, and that we should be extremely cautious about any actions that might erode that independence. Without explicitly opposing Johnson's motion, she had effectively undermined its foundation. When the votes were finally called shortly after noon, the results reflected the dramatic reversal of fortunes. Johnson's motion to remove Crockett failed 196-239, with 18 Republicans joining Democrats in opposition. Immediately following, Crockett's censure motion passed 221-212, with 11 Republicans supporting it. The clerk's formal announcement, "The motion to censure the Speaker is adopted," sent shockwaves through the chamber. Though largely symbolic, a censure of the sitting Speaker was nearly unprecedented in modern congressional history. Johnson stood stoically at the dais as the censure was read into the record, his face a mask of contained anger and humiliation. What had begun as his attempt to discipline a junior member had resulted in his own formal rebuke by the body he led. For Crockett, the victory extended far beyond surviving the removal attempt. In a single legislative day, she had transformed herself from target to victor, demonstrated formidable political skills, and established herself as a force to be reckoned with in House politics. As members filed out of the chamber, the contrasting images were striking. Johnson surrounded by aides hustling him toward the privacy of his office, and Crockett calmly accepting congratulations from colleagues with the quiet confidence of someone who had thoroughly outmaneuvered a more powerful opponent. The immediate aftermath of the censure vote unfolded with the lightning speed characteristic of modern political communication. Within minutes, censured Speaker and Crockett wins were trending nationwide. Video clips of the most dramatic floor exchanges were already cycling through news programs and social media feeds. Johnson's team moved quickly to project stability and continuity. A terse statement emphasized that the Speaker respects the House's decision, but remains focused on advancing the legislative agenda rather than procedural distractions. The message attempted to frame the censure as a minor setback, rather than a devastating rebuke. Behind closed doors, however, the political calculations were far more urgent. Senior Republicans convened an emergency conference meeting that afternoon, where Johnson faced pointed questions about his judgment in initiating the confrontation with Crockett. However, the disc in Oxford Street determined all agreement that this was completely avoidable, one committee chair stated bluntly. You turned a minor procedural dispute into a referendum on your leadership, and now we're all dealing with the fallout. The meeting revealed deepening fissures within the Republican conference. Moderates worried about the political optics of attacking a well-spoken woman of color over procedural matters, while hardliners were frustrated that Johnson had expended political capital on a personal fight rather than advancing conservative priorities. Most concerning for Johnson's future, several members privately discussed whether the censure should trigger leadership elections. Though no formal challenge emerged immediately, the conversation signaled a fundamental weakening of Johnson's position that would hamper his effectiveness moving forward. For Crockett, the victory brought immediate and tangible benefits. Democratic leadership announced her appointment to an additional high-profile committee, a move that both rewarded her effectiveness and insulated her against future removal attempts by increasing her institutional positioning. Media requests flooded her office, with major networks and publications seeking interviews about her successful defense and counter-strategy. Crockett was selective in her responses, avoiding triumphalism in favor of substantive discussions about committee independence and procedural fairness. This wasn't about personal victory, she told a prominent political podcast. It was about establishing that the rules must apply equally to all members, regardless of party, gender, or seniority. Committee independence isn't a partisan issue. It's fundamental to how Congress is designed to function. This framing proved particularly effective because it transcended typical partisan divisions. Constitutional scholars and former House parliamentarians published analyses supporting Crockett's position on committee independence, lending institutional credibility to her arguments. By the end of the week, the political implications had crystallized in ways that would shape congressional dynamics for months to come. First, Johnson's authority as Speaker had been severely compromised. Though he retained the title, his ability to enforce party discipline had weakened substantially. Members who had voted against him on the censure motion now knew they could defy leadership without immediate consequences, creating a permission structure for future independence. Second, committee chairs began asserting greater autonomy, sensing the shifting power balance. Several announced hearing schedules and witness lists without the customary advance clearance from leadership, a subtle but significant indication that Johnson's tight procedural control had fractured. Third, Crockett had established herself as a procedural expert and effective strategic operator far beyond what her sophomore status would suggest. Senior members from both parties began consulting her on rules matters, a rare acknowledgement of expertise that typically required decades to develop. Perhaps most significantly, the episode had exposed the vulnerability of leadership that relied primarily on procedural power rather than persuasion and coalition building. Johnson had attempted to use his position to silence a critic, only to discover that institutional authority required broader legitimacy to be effective. For average Americans watching from outside the Beltway, the confrontation offered a rare glimpse into how procedural fights that seemed arcane could dramatically shift power dynamics in Washington. The constitutional system of checks and balances extended beyond the three branches of government to operate within Congress itself, where strategic knowledge of rules and precedents could sometimes overcome raw political power. 1 month after the censure vote, a respected political journal published an analysis titled The Crockett Playbook, examining how a junior representative had successfully countered the most powerful position in the House. The article highlighted several key lessons. First, Crockett recognized that procedural fights are ultimately about evidence, not rhetoric. By methodically documenting patterns and specific violations, she transformed what could have been dismissed as partisan grievance into verifiable institutional concern. Second, she framed her defense in terms of institutional principles rather than partisan advantage, creating space for cross-party coalition. By emphasizing committee independence as a historical House value rather than a Democratic priority, she made it possible for institutional Republicans to support her position. Third, she demonstrated the power of preparation over position. While Johnson relied on the formal authority of his office, Crockett invested in detailed research and strategic timing that ultimately proved more decisive than institutional rank. For Johnson, the long-term damage extended beyond the immediate censure. His judgment in launching the failed removal attempt raised questions about his political instincts that would shadow the remainder of his speakership. Future historians would likely mark this confrontation as the moment when his effectiveness as Speaker began its irreversible decline. Crockett, conversely, had transformed from a promising newcomer to a consequential player in House politics. The skill with which she had countered Johnson's attack, anticipating his moves, preparing meticulous evidence, and framing the issue around institutional principles, demonstrated political abilities that typically required decades to develop. As Washington turned to other battles, the Johnson-Crockett confrontation left a lasting imprint on how power operated in the House. It served as a reminder that in a constitutional system designed with distributed rather than concentrated authority, even the highest official could be held accountable through skillful use of the institution's own rules and procedures. The episode also reinforced a timeless political lesson that attacking an opponent without fully understanding their capabilities and preparation can backfire catastrophically. Johnson had initiated the confrontation believing his institutional position guaranteed victory. Crockett had turned that confidence into vulnerability by being better prepared, more strategic, and more attuned to the principles that could build coalitions beyond partisan lines. In the end, the story of Johnson's attempted removal and resulting censure became more than a personal contest between two politicians. It represented a case study in how power functions in democratic institutions, not just through formal authority, but through preparation, strategic thinking, and the ability to build principled coalitions that transcend typical political divisions. If you found this breakdown of Washington power dynamics eye-opening, hit that subscribe button and share this video with others who value understanding how our democratic institutions really work. Leave a comment below with your thoughts on whether committee independence matters or if you think leadership should have more control over proceedings. We'll be back soon with more in-depth analysis of the forces shaping American democracy.